Do you often find yourself reaching for that contrast slider when you're editing your photographs? Well, maybe you shouldn't. Howdy everyone, I hope you're doing well. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most treacherous tools in photography, and that is the contrast slider, or just contrast in general. Contrast is often the very first thing people adjust when they're editing, because a photo might feel flat, so they decide to add contrast. And at first glance, it does look better. The photo becomes punchier, dark areas get darker, highlights get brighter, but that's exactly where the problem can actually start. If you add too much contrast, the photo begins to lose its details. Highlights get blown out, shadows turn into solid black areas without any detail, and the whole image just starts to look harsh and unnatural. Another important thing to keep in mind is that contrast is often already defined by the actual light in the moment that you took the photo. So if you're shooting at noon or in a harsh sunlight, there's actually more than enough contrast there already, and adding more of it in post-processing often is just gonna make it a lot worse. On the other hand, in fog, for example, overcast weather, or soft light, adding a bit of contrast can make sense, but really just a little. It's always better to increase contrast gradually and keep checking whether the photo still feels natural. It's also important to distinguish between global contrast and local contrast. I don't need to increase the contrast across the entire photo if I only want the main subject to stand out a little bit more. In that case, it's often better to work locally, subtly enhancing the main subject while not touching the rest of the photo. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more on how to work with local adjustments in Zoner Studio, we made a video about it and you'll also find a link in the description. But now, let's get back to contrast. Of course, it also depends on the photo and on what you want to express with it. There are images that call for balanced contrast, but also ones where stronger contrast simply looks better. A good example is black and white photography, which often looks flat and dull with low contrast. And the same applies to photos where the main subject is colorful compared to the background, and you want to emphasize that contrast even more by boosting the contrast of that color. Low contrast photos are also very trendy right now, creating a soft, sort of matte look. These images feel more delicate compared to highly contrasted ones, so it really depends on what you want to say with the photo and how you want it to affect the viewer. Personally, I like when my photos have a bit more contrast, but it's always important to keep a sense of balance. Now, the contrast slider specifically moves whites and blacks at the same ratio, and often adjusting just one of them is going to be enough. In a lot of cases though, it's enough to fine-tune the exposure using lights and shadows, and then if needed, add more blacks or whites using other sliders. This brings depth back to the photo without touching contrast itself, and the result feels much more natural and preserves all our details. Sometimes it's enough to simply raise the white point or lower the black point, and the photo immediately feels like it has more contrast, and without actually touching any of the other sliders. But this really depends on the individual image we're talking about. No matter which slider you use though, always keep an eye out on the histogram and be aware of any blown out highlights. This is what the histogram looks like when there's a lot of contrast in the photo. The values are pushed all the way to the edges, and this is what it looks like when we reduce contrast. And if you're not sure how to actually read the histogram and use that information that's presented there, we made a video about it here in the past, and you'll find a link in the description. Now let's get back to contrast. When editing, it's also important to remember that increasing contrast and exposure also increases contrast in individual colors. So if you want more contrast in whites and blacks, but the colors already feel too strong, reduce their saturation in color adjustments. And if you're not sure whether or not your photo already has too much contrast, try pulling the contrast all the way down for a moment and then add it back in again gradually from 0. A lot of times you'll find that the ideal value is actually a lot lower than you originally thought. So that was contrast and how to use it in post-processing in Zoner Studio. If you guys like this video, give us a thumbs up. Let us know what you think in the comments below, as we always like reading them. And I hope to see you in the next one. And until then, take care, and I'll see you later. Ciao.